This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
Coming up on This Week in Agribusiness, farmers from around the country and around the world gathered in Grand Island, Nebraska for Husker Harvest Days. Hello folks, thanks for tuning in to This Week in Agribusiness. I'm Mike Pearson here in the studio today. This past week was a busy week for ag news. On Monday, we started with the World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates really changing the supply and demand tables for the soybean market. And then we saw a rail strike percolate throughout the week. A lot of issues causing the markets to move rather volatilely. In the meantime, farmers shrugged that off and gathered together in Grand Island, Nebraska to take a look at some of the newest innovations, the newest products, and really the newest technology available in the world of agriculture. Max Armstrong had a chance to be in Grand Island, and he caught up with a lot of the folks who were on the grounds.
Yeah, Mike, they were lined up behind the ropes at Husker Harvest Days to see the equipment on the move, and yes, the weather cooperated in a big way. Not just in terms of the field demonstrations, the capability to have the crop ready, but also at showtime with plenty of sunshine, a good breeze, good warm weather, and it was perfect for all of the folks who wanted to attend this show. It hasn't been perfect, though, all year long for weather conditions, as you know, in Nebraska.
We know we started out cold here around April. Shut the water off and just poured it to it with the pivots. Dryland corners are, doing 86 bushel underneath the pivots where we had good water. 220, 225 for a short season corn, 95, 98 day.
During the growing season, there were some hailstorms that came across this part of the country. Did you get hit here?
By the grace of God, we missed it by 3 miles. It was 3 miles east of us. There was probably 12 or 15 pivots flipped over, fields replanted, everything. For somehow we missed it.
It was a fairly long strip too, wasn't it, through eastern Nebraska?
Yeah, it went all the way from here all the way to York, down to Beatrice, and there was 2 of them. There was 2 different storms, one in May and another one sometime in, I think, middle of June.
Well, in Nebraska specifically, we've had a good share of drought across much of the state. There are pockets in the middle of the Sand Hills, a little bit in the southeast and south central counties that have caught some decent rain, but much of the state is 50% of normal precipitation or much less than that, actually. And that's coming off a really dry winter. And so, and even a harvest season last fall was pretty dry. So we're all kind of set up for a lot of drought across much of the state. So even though we are the most irrigated state in the country, anything that isn't under a sprinkler or has water is showing some drought stress on through harvest.
Well, that's an interesting question. To what degree does irrigation protect the state's yield? In other words, even in a severe drought, what kind of a crop will you have in Nebraska?
Well, if we go back to 2012, which was the last time we had drought like this, and that was probably a little bit worse, the irrigated crop, which is, around 9 million acres in Nebraska, so that's a lot of acres, did very well. The irrigated, but a lot of the pivots had to make 10 or 12 circles to get around to make the corn, what it was. And so, yeah, the crop was pretty good, but then the dryland falls way off. And in that year it was 0. This year, 40 and 50 bushels is going to catch a lot of dryland corn and less. And a lot of it has been chopped because we're a big livestock state. There's a lot of corn silage being put up, and it was put up really early this year.
Looking over the show side here, whether it's the forage or the corn that's standing out here, everything really looks good under the pivots.
Yes, under the pivots, and that's the savior in this state. We just don't get enough rain, and these pivots do a great job, and that's what saves us.
These field demos are quite an attraction. People love to come out and line up along the rope. Explain how that whole operation works. What are some of the key elements of parading those combines and tillage tools, tractors, grain carts, etc.?
Well, usually we have our main manufacturers, your Cases and your New Hollands and your Klaus, and then we'll go to the head companies like your Drago and Capello and the GTS, and then we got our auger wagons after that.
And once again, farmers can walk in after the machines have gone through, after they pass. They stay behind the rope during the passage, but then they can walk out and get a closer look.
Yeah, once the equipment makes a pass, we'll advance the pennants, and as soon as we say it's safe, you can get down and inspect it and stuff and see what kind of job it does, see if it's worth your money, see if it's not.
So it was a good year at Husker Harvest Days to show off irrigation equipment and all of the technology that supports it. By all means, Mike, farmers are thinking about dry conditions, having the kind of summer that they've had here in the western part of the Corn Belt.
Thank you, Max. It's great to see all those folks out there enjoying the Husker Harvest Days this past year. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone Ag. The Firestone Ag Dealer Network offers you the support, inventory, and resources you need. Visit firestoneag.com to find your local certified dealer. And now it's time to talk markets. Joining us this week is Jim McCormick of agmarket.net. And Jim, between the supply and demand reports, the potential rail strike, and everything else happening in the markets, this certainly was a busy week for commodities.
Definitely so, Mike. We've had incredible volatility the last couple of weeks of the summer. And, sometimes when you get in the fall, it calms down. That is not the case this year. And I would expect the volatility to remain high as we go into harvest as we move into 2023 as well.
Jim, let's talk about those changes to the supply and demand balance sheet. First, with the soybean market. That was the big surprise to the trade on Monday. What did USDA adjust?
Well, the big thing was they did cut the harvested acres by just shy of a little over 600,000. And on top of the big thing was they cut that yield about 1.5 bushels. And that was the big surprise, Mike. I think people thought maybe they trim it a little bit, but the reality is it's very hard to know what bean crops are going to do until you get into the field. But it was an aggressive cut. And then the end result was that carryout comes down to about 200 million bushels. And that is a relatively tight carryout. And the other thing we need to make note is kind of offsetting that cut in production was a dramatic cut in demand. They cut export demand by about 70 million bushels. So the real question the trade's going to be asking themselves is, are we high enough to really cut that much export demand off the balance sheet? And time will tell.
Well, Jim, and it's been kind of tough to tell because we have not been getting export sales reports from the USDA for the past month. That changed this week. How did U.S. exports fare over the past month?
Well, overall, yeah, due to some technical difficulties, we haven't had any weekly export sales. And what it turns out is, at least on the bean front, the bean sales this week, the net was a little bit better than what the trade was thinking. It looks like China might have snuck in and was a little bit more aggressive than what the trade was thinking, as there was not a reporting season, reports being made. But here's the crux of it. We're about 110 million bushels ahead of where we were last year at this time. So overall, you've got to be a little bit optimistic on the sales, at least on the domestic front. But we do have some pretty big headwinds right now with Argentina, because they've made some economic policies down there that are really bringing a lot of beans to market. And that could cause some pretty good difficulties for our exports.
Jim, let's talk about that Argentina change. They're paying their soybean exporters more money in Argentinian pesos to move more beans. Is it working?
It is definitely working. Essentially what they're doing, folks, is they're giving their producers or their sellers about a 30% price increase to encourage them to sell the beans, because they need the revenue, plain and simple. Traditionally, though, what's going on is normally Argentina, they don't sell beans onto the open market, Mike. They tend to sell it to processors who then sell meal and oil. Well, they need the revenue so bad, they're given these huge incentive to sell the beans. They've sold roughly 6.7 million metric tons of beans so far in the last 10 days, or roughly 246 million bushels. Now, here's the scary part. They've got roughly 22 million more metric tons of beans to sell. This special pricing they're giving them ends at the end of the month. So there's a lot of economic incentive for the Argentina producer to continue to sell beans aggressively. And then on top of it, that was kind of the carrot, but there's a stick on the other end, Mike. They're talking about maybe taxing beans or taxing, maybe loans if the producer carries more than 10% of his old crop beans forward into the new crop. So there's a huge economic incentive for those producers down there to dump the beans, and that could cause our export sales, which are running ahead of pace currently, to actually go behind pace if they get too aggressive and take too much of our market share.
Now, Jim, but if Argentina is moving all their beans off their ports this month, doesn't that present an opportunity for us later in the year to grab that business back?
Well, it should give us a little bit of opportunity, but where the opportunity may end up coming is on the form of products. So like I said, traditionally, essentially, they turn those beans to meal and oil. If they're selling the beans, raw beans, out to the Chinese, those people that normally buy the meal and oil from the Argentinians, they're going to have to find a new supplier. So that does open the door for us down the line to potentially sell more meal and oil to the open market.
All right. And Jim, Brazilian planting set to begin here shortly. Do you think they're going to put more acres in the ground?
Right now is anticipated they're going to plant a record amount of acreage and a record amount of yield. We'll see what happens, Mike. We're in the third season, La Nina. That is the talk right now. So weather will determine how big of a crop South America has.
All right, and we'll be back for more market conversation with Jim McCormick of agmarket.net when This Week in Agribusiness returns. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone Ag. Harvey Firestone invented the first pneumatic farm tire, forever changing what it means to farm hard. Visit firestoneag.com to learn more about this history and tire solutions for today. We're talking markets with Jim McCormick of agmarket.net. And Jim, on Monday's supply and demand estimates from USDA, we also saw the corn crop get a little bit smaller. Wasn't too much of a shock to the trade. What were you expecting on Monday?
Well, actually, Mike, they came in right what we were thinking and pretty much right what the trade was thinking. They did cut that corn yield as anticipated. Probably the biggest surprise was they did cut about 1 million acres off of the corn production. That was a little bit more than people thought they might do. But the net result was about a 1.2 billion carryout, which is really in line with what the trade's thinking. But where that 1.2 gets really curious is how they got to it. Like I said, we did cut the supply side pretty hard, but they turned around, Mike, and really cut demand hard. They've cut demand about 570 million bushels year on year, and it felt like they really got aggressive because they don't want to drop the carryout number below 1.2 billion this early in the game, because 1.2 billion roughly is about 1 month's worth of supply, or roughly, pipeline levels. So we'll see if this demand numbers cut is really as high as they think. I'm a little bit skeptical of it. We've got obviously production problems here, but we had a lot of production problems in Europe. You've had some problems in China potentially. So if the world falters a little bit, the demand will come back and the government will have to start raising that demand back up.
And Jim, we hear a lot about how small crops get smaller, short crops get shorter. Is that a thing you think might develop here with this 22 corn crop?
I think there's a very good likelihood we could see it get a little bit smaller, plain and simple. It wasn't the best of ending season in a lot of areas. And that is the history. I think it's 70–80% of the time when they lower the crop from August to September, that crop does get smaller. So that happens. You got to find a way to ration demand more. And like I said, with us cutting demand 570 million bushels, it's that much tougher to offset that lost production. The other thing I'm watching, Mike, here, and at the end of the month, we have the quarterly grain stock report. Now, the government came out on this report and said we got 1,525 million bushels of corn left over at the end of the year. But when you look at how high the basis was and how strong the basis was all the way through the latter part of summer until we bridged to the old crop to new crop, it was relatively stout. And I think that might come into question is, do we really have essentially 300 million more bushels of corn available this year than they're projected for this upcoming year? And if they would find for some reason, let's say that quarterly grain stock's 100, 200 million less available than what we thought, that just brings this new crop carry out from 1.2 down to 1.1 down to 1, which in essence is pipeline level. That gets very, very bullish potentially.
It does indeed. And Jim, we've got to look out, I think, to the 2023 crop year as well. We continue to hear reports of fertilizer production shutting down across Europe. Do you have any thoughts on acreage for 23 as of yet?
Well, right now, I think the early surveys are suggesting we're going to plant more corn. I think that's the logical assumption at this point in time due to the pricing and what's going on with the competition in the world on beans. But the reality is Europe is shutting down fertilizer production due to the price of nat gas. All assumptions are nat gas prices are going to stay high all winter long in Europe. And they've got to make a decision, folks, plain and simple. Either they're going to heat their homes or they're going to make fertilizer. And we know what the choice is. They're going to heat the home. So that is going to make fertilizer supplies, not just in the United States tight, but around the world. So, then you get the question, will they produce, will we pick up those extra acres? Now, there's one other factor we got to keep an eye on, Mike, is South America crop. Brazil could help bridge the gap if they have a huge crop. No doubt about it. They're talking record acres, potentially record yield like they do every year. But if for some reason Brazil would stumble, then that balance sheet gets even tighter yet because the world numbers are tightening even with an optimistic viewpoint of South America's crop. If South America crop stumbles, it's going to force demand in the United States that we don't have a supply, and there's only one thing prices can do at that time is they got to go higher as a way to discourage consumption.
All right, could be some excitement left here in the grain market as we get through the tail end of 2022. Jim McCormick of agmarket.net, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Chad Colby's look at agriculture technology comes your way next, brought to you by the IBM Watson Decision Platform, combining AI with Internet of Things data to help agribusiness increase yields, improve quality, and drive sustainability.
As harvest activities pick up across the country, farms are active sites this time of year. Chad Colby wants us to take a minute and think about the safety of our operations.
On this week's technology segment, we're going to step back a little bit and talk about safety. I heard down past Springfield, actually, there were some soybeans being harvested, but for the most part, only some seed corn has been picked. The reality with safety is it's everybody's responsibility. I noticed the Farm Bureau and other organizations this past week were making posts online about what you can do to be safe. Max and I talked about it this week. There's already been some tragedies on the road. What I would encourage everyone to do is to do your part. If you drive a semi on a farm, or you run the auger cart, or you're the combine driver, it's your responsibility to walk around that equipment and make sure everything is correct. The lights work, the strobes work, whatever it might be. If you have questions, talk to your local equipment dealer. They've got some great new technology that I'm sure they would be happy to help you with. Maybe you need a bright new slow-moving vehicle sign, or perhaps maybe you need to upgrade those lights on the back of your auger cart or wagons to some super bright LEDs. The reality is those little things can go a long way. And for those of you that travel on these rural roads during the harvest time, be sure to give yourself a little extra time and certainly a little extra space between you and the equipment. One thing I've noticed over the years, you have to remember, all the grain in these fields, they got to exit the fields. So pay careful attention to those semis that are pulling out of these fields. A lot of times they need an extra room as well. And remember, they're going a lot slower than you. Again, give yourself a little extra space and a little extra time. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask either. And remember this, there's a lot of part-time help on these farms. Make sure you have those conversations over the next couple weeks about what their role is in terms of safety on the farm. For This Week in Agribusiness, I'm Chad Colby.
Thank you, Chad. That's great advice any time of year, but it's especially apt here at harvest time. And folks, stick with us. Later on This Week in Agribusiness, we're going to talk to Mike Steenhoek. He's the director of the Soy Transportation Coalition, and he was tracking the rail strike issues all week, and he has an update for us as we prepare for next week. Well, thanks for joining us this weekend for This Week in Agribusiness. Farmers across the Corn Belt are gearing up for harvest, but farmers across the High Plains are wrapping up that wheat harvest. Joining us now is Colter Brown. He's the director for Northern Ag Network up in Montana. And Colter, how are Montana producers feeling as wheat harvest comes to a close?
Well, it's a big feeling of relief just to be able to have harvest done and something in the bin. You know, it's a really interesting year comparing back to 2021, which was just a terrible drought year across Montana and certainly across the western Dakotas as well. For a lot of producers, considerably better moisture this year, and of course that leads to a considerably better crop. So I think as the numbers flow in, we'll see on the small grain summary at the end of the month, but I think we're going to see a crop that's 50 to 100% larger than last year, but that's not saying a whole lot. Drought still a major issue in the major wheat producing region in Montana, the Golden Triangle in the north central part of the state. A lot of guys I talked to were still zeroed out on their crop insurance. Some of them didn't even hardly have to get the combine out. So tough harvest for some, but others substantially improved. So for guys, it's just a relief to have something to cut if you can, get it in the bin, avoid the hailstorms, and boy, hope for a better year next year that has better moisture and hopefully a better cost environment too.
As you mentioned, that additional moisture this year, of course, Montana cattle producers felt it last year in the drought. Pastures looking a little bit better as we head into fall now?
Oh boy, I'd be tough to say they're looking better. I mean, we started the year better in the eastern part of the state, had big snowstorms in April right during calving season that were tough, but kind of changed the moisture conditions in eastern Montana and stayed okay through June. One big rain in early July, but since then it's been pretty dry, and most of the guys I talked to really question the drought monitor. They say that's not what it looks like here. It is dry and kind of staying that way, but September, October, we can usually break up that moisture situation, maybe get a little fall growth going. So I'd say we're optimistic, but pastures have seen better days.
Optimistic, but challenges still persist. Coulter, I wanted to ask you about a story that came across my radar a little earlier. Army Corps of Engineers looks like they want to reduce the flow out of the Fort Peck Dam. Why does that matter to Montana farmers?
Well, why it matters is really for the producers downriver on the Missouri River, because they're cutting that flow rate means less water available. And here at this time of the year, we're getting very close to the sugar beet harvest really going full steam. Had some growers start on early dig already within the last week, but really it's just that critical time. We've almost got the crop there and still need that water available. So for the producers in far eastern Montana, they just need that water for a little bit longer. It seems almost like a silly issue that we have to bring this up at all. We have to irrigate crops. If you have to cut the flow rate, do it after harvest. So we certainly appreciate Attorney General Austin Knudsen stepping in and alerting the Army Corps that we just can't have this yet. Just give us 4 more weeks.
Well, and hopefully bringing it to their attention will stop that issue. Coulter Brown, director at the Northern Ag Network, thanks for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Joining us now is Brian Ernest. He is the lead economist for animal protein at the CoBank Knowledge Exchange, and Brian has been researching the impact of HPAI. Brian, we're starting to see that high-path avian influenza make its return, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. It's something that we don't typically see this late in the year. It was an issue for U.S. flocks back in 2015. Really saw the cases subside through the summer months and didn't necessarily resurge in the fall period. But more recently, we've seen some outbreaks in Ohio that gives some reason for concern for poultry producers again this fall.
Now, Brian, you mentioned we saw that outbreak 7 years ago of HPAI. We've had this new one. How has 2022's been worse in some regards than that one from 2014?
Well, I think the impact in terms of a market standpoint, and I'm purely looking at economics of these instances, for U.S. egg producers and turkey producers, more strain on the system exacerbated from the strain that we saw last year and in 2020 with producing enough eggs and turkey for U.S. consumption and in exports.
Where do you see pricing moving as we get through the end of 2022?
Well, it's interesting. I think that volatility will continue. Looking at price conditions over the last couple weeks, table egg prices started to subside moving into the back to school time frame, but they're rising again here, sitting at near historic levels. Overall, when you look at production metrics, still relatively muted growth there, which gives us an expectation that we'll continue to see strong prices at least through the end of the third quarter and into fourth.
Well, Brian, we start getting into the third and fourth quarter 2022. We're going to get to Thanksgiving and a lot of turkey demand. That industry has certainly been hit by HPAI. What have turkey prices done here over the past year?
Interestingly, there were quite a few turkeys put away at the beginning of the year in preparation for Thanksgiving this year. So we saw more hens and toms making their way into the freezers earlier and some of those stocks building. But since then, as HPAI has impacted overall production, that building of cold storage has slowed down a little bit and prices have skyrocketed. Typically this time of year, you're seeing whole birds around $1, maybe $1.20. And I think the latest wholesale prices have been recorded in the $1.80 area. So that will impact what we're seeing on the shelf when consumers are getting ready for Thanksgiving this year.
All right, going to be an expensive Thanksgiving turkey, Brian?
I think it will, especially for fresh, and especially if we continue to see HPAI linger in the flocks. That will limit the ability for the industry to grow the supply side for fresh turkey production.
All right, we'll see how this plays out as the year comes to a close. Brian Ernest of CoBank.
This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
Welcome back to This Week in Agribusiness. If you've been paying attention to the news over this past week, one of the ongoing stories was the risk of a rail strike on America's Class 1 railroads. It appears that concern has been put on the back burner for now after a tentative agreement between those two parties. Joining us now to talk about it is Mike Steenhoek. He's the executive director of the Soy Transportation Coalition. And Mike, this rail strike over the past week certainly had to keep you jumping as grain exporters were concerned what this could mean.
Yeah, the prospect of a strike, a lockout, or even a slowdown was just so profound and unsavory to our industry, given the fact that farmers simply cannot be profitable and agriculture cannot be successful without a well-functioning rail system. 30% of U.S. soybean exports are transported by rail, and our other modes of transportation, the inland waterway system, our trucking sector, as capable as it is, it just simply doesn't have the capacity to absorb what our freight railroads transport on a given day. So the fact that there is this tentative agreement that averts the potential for this strike was very welcome news. And now we can proceed as we enter into harvest season with farmers being the suppliers, the world leading suppliers of food, high quality, that the world, that are both our domestic customers and our international customers desperately need.
Absolutely. Now, Mike, this agreement that we have seen put forward by the two parties, do we know exactly what's in it? What are the railroad employees going to be getting?
It's very consistent with the suggestions that were espoused by the Presidential Emergency Board, and that was appointed by President Biden to develop a series of recommendations for the two parties to consider. The real highlight of that is a 24% wage increase for the railroad workers over the 5-year period of that contract. So a little bit less than 5% annually as it averages out on an annual basis. And then there's some disagreements on issues like paid time off, on sick days, on scheduling, and those kind of things. And some of those things still remain, and those will continue to be negotiated in the future. But really the big issues relate to those kind of scheduling and also pay increase issues. The fact that they have this tentative agreement to avert that strike, that's really key.
And Mike, we've said repeatedly, it's a tentative agreement. This has not yet been agreed upon by the members of the union. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's always been the process, that you have the union leadership that will come to the tentative agreement, and then it goes to the rank and file members. Those votes will likely occur over the next several weeks. My expectation is that the rank and file members will vote to ratify it, even though there are still lingering disagreements and disputes and hard feelings, quite frankly, among both sides. But the consequences of having any kind of slowdown or strike, and politically speaking, on the eve of a midterm election as well, our nation needs a railroad strike or slowdown like we need a hole in the head right now. And everyone does recognize that, including our political leadership. So that's why you saw both the administration and congressional leaders very engaged throughout the course of this week. So we're hopeful that we will see, and we expect to see, ratification by the union members.
And Mike, until we get to ratification, the union members are no longer allowed to strike, right? The cooling off period is still in effect?
Yeah, it does prevent that strike from, or a lockout from occurring, so we can kind of get back to rail service resuming. We were seeing during the course of the week a dial down or even a suspension of service in certain segments, and that was increasing with each passing day as that potential strike was looming on the horizon. So now we can get back to seeing rail service recover from that. It will take a number of days. But that's something that we're certainly hopeful for, because we're currently experiencing a lack of reliability of rail service, taking out of consideration the contract dispute. We have some real significant supply chain challenges, and that includes our rail sector. So this is the time for rail service to improve, not take a step back. If we would have had a strike, that would have been a major step back.
It certainly would have been. Hopefully that strike has been, or that issue has been, at least temporarily resolved. Mike Steenhoek, Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition, thanks for joining us, and thanks for keeping your eye on this issue, because it will have a massive impact on American agriculture.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be with you.
Greg Solier now brings us his farm weather forecast for the week ahead, presented by Pivot BioProven 40. Predictable, productive,
Weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot Bio Proven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
It's time to take a look at the weather. Joining us now is meteorologist Greg Solier. And Greg, it has been hot and the fire risk has been pronounced in the Pacific Northwest. Any relief?
Yes, some relief, but I tell you, the past week to 10 days, upwards of 800,000 acres up in smoke. And yeah, that smoke really degrading air quality into the Pacific Northwest, parts of Big Sky Country, Northern Great Basin. But looky here, a nice upper air trough. And by the way, 155,000 acres of that was situated in the eastern and northeastern sections of Oregon. So relief with cooler to colder air, moisture laden, not anything super impressive, but again, a change in weather should help to at least ease the fire threat and bring into containment some of those fires, which are running at only maybe 10 or 20% containment to begin with in the Northwest. So here's this frontal boundary stretched on out. Seasonal warmth over the high plains, a couple of showers and thunderstorms getting in the way of the last of wheat harvest across the Canadian Prairie, and a weather system down through areas of Northern California. Some of this moisture, by the way, left over from Kay that came ashore about a week to 10 days ago. But again, later in the week, back into milder, drier, warmer environs along and basically west of the Divide in Northern California. Opportunities to resume harvest operations. Some cooler, drier air in across the Dakotas, maybe a little whimper of frost into the southern Canadian Prairie. Not anything unusual for the time of year there. Here in the southwestern states, kind of the southern extension of that upper trough making its way across the desert southwest about a week to 10 days ago when Kay came ashore, 86-mile-an-hour winds down there in Phoenix. And we'll get into some additional showers and thunderstorms with some lingering leftover tropical moisture. The heat is broken and will even do so significantly into the valleys of California for the early portion of the week. Meanwhile, look at the heat and humidity, and 90 to 95, maybe surging up near 100 degrees despite the calendar date into parts of the central and southern plains. We may bust the cap and generate a stray shower thunderstorm there. Otherwise, the system moves inland. Still some lingering troughiness into the central and southern high plains, and a couple of more showers and thunderstorms. They'll take anything they can get moisture-wise. About 10 to 15% of that wheat crop has been planted across the plains, parts of Colorado as well. And looky here again, Mike, another tropical system brushing by Baja California.
Greg, how does this all play out as you start looking at the central corridor of the U.S.?
Pretty nice if you're into perhaps some late summer warmth and the lack of anything worrisome in the moisture department. Of course, we need it. It is still a mighty tough go of it. Western and southern Iowa points on westward. We've seen improvement through parts of Big Sky Country, the upper Midwest, and across the eastern Corn Belt with just a smattering of shower and thunderstorm activity and slightly cooler air on the move into the early portion of the week. The heat is still there and it comes back into play out of the plains. Western and central and southern Corn Belt may be up around 90 before another cool front moves on by. Scattering of showers and thunderstorms, no real cold air, just cooler, more seasonal temperatures in the wake of this weather system. Still plenty of opportunity to push the back 40 towards the maturity and harvest as well in some parts of the Midwest. Hot and humid, the hot ridge, and 100-degree heat or more. Oklahoma and Texas, we've seen improvement with drought here and here, ongoing obviously farther to the north. Here's high pressure across the lower sections of the Mississippi Valley. Very wet across Louisiana here the past few weeks. Sugarcane planting operations well behind average. Here are tropical rains into Baja, the southwestern states. Heat over West Texas, as well as back in the lower Mississippi Valley. A couple of showers and thunderstorms may bust the cap into parts of the Ohio Valley later in the week.
Well, Greg, give us that update. Ohio Valley, East Coast, what do you see?
Pretty nice if you, again, want more summertime weather, more growing degree day units, and a little more moisture as well into some areas that have seen improvement into the northeast and New England. Warmth and humidity here up near 90 into parts of the central and southern Corn Belt. Drier, more comfortable air, northern and western complex. That system moves on by into the northeast and New England, back into maybe 80s for the Midwest. Note the scattered showers and thunderstorms for the upper Midwest and slightly cooler air there. Busy and wet weather pattern over the southeastern states. Some improvement moisture-wise down through Florida. The heat certainly capping the atmosphere into the lower Mississippi Valley. As the week wears on, this will be a tropical system of named origins. Watch the wet weather pick up over this part of the country. Hot and humid weather continues and dry time much needed down across the Delta.
Greg Solier is back with his extended farm weather forecast for the country, presented by Pivot Bio Proven 40. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot Bio Proven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
Greg Solier still with us talking weather. Greg, looking out to next week, fall gets started. What does that precipitation look like?
No, first of all, really nothing resembling a fall weather pattern with a storminess and or a cool down in temperature reading, still feeling like in some areas mid to late summertime. And yeah, I know it may get in the way of harvest operations, but maybe half to we'll do an inch over parts of the northern and western Corn Belt locales, perhaps up to an inch or two, and a couple of strong and severe storms only Ohio Valley. This is the corridor that'll get action packed with a named system getting awfully close, and things are picking up across the Atlantic late portion of the week. Some dry time, at least drier weather across Louisiana, much needed. Nothing organized through Texas, but the Southwest could be a different story with another feature down through Baja, moving on northward, and some moisture as well scattered to spotty across the Pacific Northwest as autumn clocks in on the 22nd, little after 8 in the Central Time Zone.
Well, Greg, the week after September 26th, how do things look?
Real no cool or cold air in sight here for the few weeks to come, for that matter. Largely blocked up here across the southeastern Canadian prairie. Look at the warmth, still capable of 90, maybe 95-degree heat for the beginning part of October into the Great Plains. Parts of the Ohio Valley, rapid crop maturation, worsening drought conditions. That's the flip side of that. Sliver of below average temperatures down across the southeastern part of the country. Tropics in the Pacific still busy. That just throws up tropical moisture into the monsoon setup over the southwestern part of the country. Downpours for the Gulf Coast, a wide area of dry time. And if you have even keeled soil moisture and rainfall this summertime season, opportunities for harvest, more wet weather. That's good news for parts of Big Sky Country.
Greg, that first full week in October, October 3rd, does the temperature start to feel at all like fall?
Not really. It's maybe more or less still late August and or perhaps early September. If not that, it's a July feel. You get the picture. Lots of summertime for the upper Midwest, northern plains, northern and central parts of the Rockies. Slightly cooler air on the move and cloudiness over the eastern states. Temperatures about normal on through the southern plains. Moisture pattern is great for the Pacific Northwest. Big skies, southern Canadian prairie, the Dakotas into parts of Minnesota. So the far northern Corn Belt, maybe some harvest delays, but it's all ahead forward. Central and southern parts of the Corn Belt, yeah, we need more moisture as well for those newly sown winter wheat fields over the central and southern plains. Tropical rains, tropical systems, we told you it'll get ramped up pretty quick in a hurry, and it's doing just that as we head towards the mid-stretch of October.
Greg, that week of October 10th, did temps start to cool off?
Temperatures do not really cool off substantially over the southeastern states, the western states, but they will through the upper Midwest. Even a sliver of cold air, maybe this season's first frost potential and freeze a little bit late to the upper Midwestern portion of the country. When we get that trough position, here goes the moisture. Canadian prairie into the eastern Corn Belt and a tropical weather pattern that'll be busy up and down the eastern seaboard.
Next on This Week in Agribusiness, it's Max's Tractor Shed, spotlighting another great American tractor.
Well, now it can be told after all these years that back in the day as young men on the farm, many of us probably did, indeed, lust after the neighbor's tractor. In my case, it was a Farmall 1206. We'll show you one in a Max's Tractor Shed. Brought to you by Store Lock Tool Cabinets. At the outdoor farm shows this year, you saw those cabinets up close and personal. You had the chance to lean against them, see the beauty of the cabinets and the functionality too. Now go to the website and get all of the details and give them a call. Go to the website storelock.com. Some of us remember our teenage years and spending a lot of time out there on the tractor. And especially we recall when the neighbor came down the road on his brand new tractor, one that your dad didn't have. In my case, it was indeed a Farmall 1206. This one belongs to Fred Petch, and we saw that tractor this week at Husker Harvest Days in Nebraska. This is a 1966 1206. Fred said it was made, according to the serial number, in December of 1966. Fred Petch's 1206 at Milford, Nebraska. Well, if you're looking for a tractor, maybe a truck, combine, a very new one perhaps, let's see if there's going to be something crossing the block you'll be interested in at Big Iron Auctions. Here's the weekly report from Big Iron.
Hi, Max. BigIron.com is a proud supporter of FFA, and September the 21st, we'll be conducting a benefit auction for the South Dakota FFA Foundation. We'd like to thank all those companies that have donated items for that sale, and of course, thanks to all the bidders and buyers who are supporting FFA. We've got some really nice retirement sales coming up on September the 21st as well. Darlene Warden is from Huntley, Montana. They're selling a John Deere 318D skidster with 1,057 hours. Dunnick Inc. is selling over 700 lots of bridge construction equipment in conjunction with a fundraising event for NUCA. Items located in Minnesota. Art Anderson Farms Inc. out of Arcadia, Nebraska will be selling a 2015 Stolly West Dew Point alfalfa steaming machine. Marjorie L. Stevenson out of Rosedale, Indiana will be selling her 2001 Case IH 2388 combine. And Nebraska Ag and Irrigation Inc. out of Cozad, Nebraska. They've been in business for a number of years. They have a retirement sale featuring a lot of irrigation equipment. Plus, next week, folks, we have our special classic car auction featuring Roadrunners, Mustangs, Camaros, Wildcats. Just a great selection of classic cars, all selling to the highest bidder. Check out all the land, machinery, and classics selling on BigIron.com.
All across the country, FFA continues to nurture that next generation of agricultural leaders, and we like to get to know them here on This Week in Agribusiness. Joining us now is Braden Huffman. He's the past FFA Ohio State Vice President at Large. And Braden, how was convention this past year?
Convention was really exciting. We had near record-breaking attendance, and we had members from all across the state of Ohio come and join us at the Convention Center in Columbus.
Braden, thinking back to your year of service serving at the state FFA level, what were some of the highlights for you?
Ooh, some of the highlights definitely are our FFA Camp Muskingum. We bring in a couple hundred kids from across the state. We do interactive leadership workshops. And probably a highlight from a chapter visit I had is actually a pie tasting competition in December from the Coldwater FFA chapter in Ohio. It was really unique and interesting.
That is fantastic. A lot of fun opportunities in FFA. And Braden, what was it that prompted you to join FFA in the first place?
I think I wanted a place to fit in my high school, and our local FFA chapter had like a wide range of personalities that came together to form leadership necessarily around agriculture. So I think that's really what brought me in, and just the lifelong bonds with friends and family, and overall just became family.
Braden, after your year of service, are you inspired to try to keep a career in agriculture going forward?
I'm undecided. Half of me wants to do agricultural education and the other half wants to do policy regarding around agriculture. So I think I will be in the agricultural field in the future, but necessarily I don't know where I will stand on that.
Well, we wish you the absolute best. Braden Huffman, past Ohio State FFA Vice President at Large. Thanks for joining us here on This Week in Agribusiness.
Thanks for having me.
Husker Harvest Days, of course, not just the world's largest irrigated farm show, it's also a livestock show with cattle handling demonstrations, and it attracts folks from the cattle industry. While he was there, Max had a chance to check in with Chad Tentinger. He's the man behind Cattlemens Heritage and their new approach to beef packing.
So Cattlemens Heritage is a packing plant that we're going to be building in Council Bluffs. It'll be 2,000 head a day. We'll process about 540,000 head a year. It started with the fundamental belief that we need more capacity in this space in the Midwest. You know, right now we're on the cattle cycle, we're in the downside, the herd's a little lighter, but everybody remembers 3 years ago, 2 years ago, when we were backing cattle up 6 weeks, couldn't get cattle through. Fundamentally, I believe that we are feeding more cattle back in the Midwest since the 80s. It took them away from us, and we're going to have to add capacity in this space.
How will producers work with you? Give us a little bit of a description of how the setup will work.
So right now what we're going to do is we are in the process of selling 450,000 shackles. So as a producer buys a shackle, they pay $250 to buy the shackle, and every time they deliver for 10 years, they get $50 return premium, plus access to a grid that is based off of the box beef cutout and not the CME.
So it's a 10-year agreement.
It's a 10-year contract, and if you don't like the grid at any particular time, you can still take a cash option. So that every once in a while we see the box beef cutout and the CME get inverted. Doesn't happen very often. I don't know if it ever happened again, but if it does, the cash option is available, and the cash option will just be the average bid in your area for that week.
So the producer wouldn't be locked in totally then, you're saying?
No, it'll be the producer's choice. You can access a grid that will pay premiums tied to the box beef cutout. But again, if you're not comfortable with that or you don't think that's going to be the best deal that week, take the cash option. There is no mechanism here that you can be forced to deliver cattle under value.
Just so folks would know, you are in the cattle business yourself, right? Along with the building industry.
Yeah, so I've been building cattle buildings throughout the Midwest for the last 15 years. I've also a lifelong cattle feeder, 4th generation. I still feed cattle with my dad and brother in Northwest Iowa to this day. We still feed a lot of cattle and deliver them the same as everybody else does. And fundamentally, I think that's what really drove this to start. We just, as a family, as a long term, we want to make sure the 6th generation can do this. And I have true concerns about 6th generation getting into this business on the path we're on.
Chad, are you confident about having a market for the cattle?
Yeah, to date, we have had over 40 companies worldwide reach out to us to buy 100% of our beef. The demand for high quality Midwest beef is extremely high, and that's because fundamentally the world knows that the family farm, where we are right here standing here today, the family farmers do the best in the world to feed these cattle, and the consumers want to buy that product.
Anything else we should know? How should a farmer, a producer find out more?
Shackle Space at cattlemensheritage.com is a great place to reach out to us. We also have 10 Corp site, which is a construction company that builds the barns, that you can reach out through that. We're on social media everywhere, so just type in Cattlemen's Heritage and there's a lot of ways to get a hold of us. And we want to come out, we want to sit down, we want to meet everybody and make sure that the right information's out so producers can make the right decisions for their process and future generations.
Thank you, Max. It's neat to live in a time when we've got so many new people and new brains tackling some of the issues that are there in the meat processing industry. And folks, thanks to all of you for tuning in this week. We'll be back next week with another look at the issues that continue to impact agriculture and the prices farmers receive on their farms. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week, same time, same place, right here.
Closed captioning for This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Kubota. Shape your world. This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Case IH. This Week in Agribusiness is produced by Omax Communication in association with 22 Creative Group. We invite you to visit us online at agbizweek.com.